The transatlantic slave trade represents one of the most profoundly horrific chapters in the history of humanity. It was a system of forced migration and brutal exploitation that spanned centuries. This vast enterprise involved numerous European nations, each playing a significant role in its operation and expansion. Their participation fueled the trade and shaped its trajectory across the Atlantic. The trade inflicted a devastating and lasting impact on the African continent. It led to immense demographic shifts, economic disruption, and the destruction of communities and cultures. Equally devastating was its impact on the Americas. The forced labor of millions built economies and societies, while simultaneously creating systems of racial hierarchy and oppression that persist to this day. Several primary European powers were deeply involved in the transatlantic slave trade from its inception. Their colonial ambitions in the Americas were the driving force behind their participation. Portugal was among the earliest and most significant European nations to engage in the trade. They established trading posts along the African coast and pioneered the direct shipment of enslaved people across the Atlantic. Spain also played a crucial role, particularly in the early stages of colonization in the Caribbean and South America. They relied heavily on enslaved labor for mining and agriculture. Great Britain eventually became the dominant force in the trade, transporting more enslaved Africans than any other nation. British merchants and the Crown profited immensely from this human trafficking. France was another major participant, establishing colonies in the Caribbean and North America that demanded a constant supply of enslaved workers. Their involvement grew significantly over time. The Netherlands, through the Dutch West India Company, also participated actively in the trade. They controlled key trading routes and colonies, contributing to the scale of the enterprise. Denmark, though smaller in scale compared to other powers, was also involved. They maintained colonies in the Caribbean that utilized enslaved labor. These European nations established extensive colonies throughout the Americas, from North America and the Caribbean to Central and South America. The economic viability of these colonies, in their view, depended on a readily available and exploitable labor force. They relied heavily, almost exclusively, on enslaved labor to develop and maintain their colonial economies. Indigenous populations were initially exploited but rapidly decimated by disease and violence, leading Europeans to turn increasingly to Africa. Enslaved labor was primarily used to cultivate highly profitable cash crops for export back to Europe. These crops fueled the economies of the colonizing nations. Examples of these crucial cash crops included sugar, particularly in the Caribbean and Brazil. Sugar plantations were notoriously brutal environments with extremely high mortality rates for enslaved workers. Tobacco was another major cash crop, especially in the North American colonies. Its labor-intensive cultivation drove the demand for enslaved people. Cotton also became a key crop cultivated by enslaved people, particularly with the invention of the cotton gin. This invention dramatically increased the profitability of cotton and the demand for enslaved labor in the southern United States. The process by which individuals in Africa became enslaved and entered the transatlantic trade was complex and multifaceted. It involved various actors and circumstances. European traders were central to the system, navigating the Atlantic and establishing trading relationships along the African coast. They provided the ships and the market for enslaved people. However, the process was often facilitated by the involvement of African individuals, rulers, and trading networks. This internal dynamic was exploited by European demand. Some Africans were simply kidnapped and stolen directly by European raiders or their African allies. These acts of pure violence were a component of the trade. Kidnapping often occurred during sudden raids on villages or during periods of conflict between different groups. Vulnerable populations were particularly targeted. A significant portion of those enslaved were sold by other Africans. This occurred for a variety of reasons, often linked to existing social and political structures within Africa. Sales by Africans were frequently due to pre-existing systems of slavery or servitude within various African societies. These systems differed significantly from the chattel slavery of the Americas. Reasons for existing slavery within Africa included debt bondage, where individuals were enslaved to pay off debts. This was often a temporary condition. Punishment for crimes was another reason for enslavement within Africa. Individuals convicted of offenses might be sentenced to servitude. Prisoners of war could also be enslaved within Africa following conflicts between kingdoms or communities. These captives represented a source of labor or potential trade goods. African kingdoms and traders actively participated in the transatlantic trade, acting as intermediaries. They controlled access to interior regions and organized the movement of captives to coastal trading posts. They sought European goods in exchange for enslaved people. These commodities included items like guns, gunpowder, textiles, alcohol, and manufactured goods. Enslaved people were the primary commodity exchange for these European goods. This trade created a destructive cycle, fueling conflict and incentivizing the capture and sale of human beings. The background of the enslaved population forcibly transported across the Atlantic was incredibly diverse. They did not come from a single culture or region. They came from various regions across West and Central Africa, spanning a vast geographical area with distinct histories and societies. Major regions included Senegambia, the Gold Coast, the Bight of Benin, the Bight of Biafra, and Angola. The population encompassed a wide range of ethnicities, each with unique traditions, social structures, and political organizations. This diversity was often deliberately suppressed in the Americas. They represented diverse languages, making communication difficult among captives and further isolating them from one another. Hundreds of different languages were spoken among those enslaved. They came from various cultures, including complex kingdoms, decentralized communities, and nomadic groups. Their cultural heritage was rich and varied. The majority of those enslaved were young adults. Traders sought individuals who were strong and capable of performing demanding physical labor. They were often in their prime working years, typically between the ages of 15 and 30. Children and older individuals were also enslaved, but in smaller proportions. They were forcibly uprooted from their homes, often violently seized from their villages or communities. This was a traumatic and sudden separation. They were forcibly uprooted from their families, severing kinship ties and destroying social bonds. Families were frequently separated during capture or sale. They were forcibly uprooted from their communities, losing their social support networks and cultural context. This displacement was a key element of the dehumanization process. After capture, they endured a brutal and perilous journey across the Atlantic Ocean. This voyage was characterized by extreme suffering and high mortality rates. This journey is infamously known as the Middle Passage. Conditions on slave ships were horrific, with captives packed tightly, subjected to disease, starvation, and violence. The primary destinations for enslaved Africans were the colonies established by European powers in the Americas. The distribution varied over time and by colonizing nation. The Caribbean islands were major destinations for enslaved people. The intense labor required for sugar cultivation led to a constant demand and high death rates. Jamaica, a British colony, received a massive number of enslaved Africans. It became one of the most profitable sugar-producing colonies, built entirely on enslaved labor. Barbados, another British island, was an early and significant destination. It served as a model for plantation economies and slave societies throughout the Caribbean. Haiti, then the French colony of Saint-Domingue, was also a significant destination and the most profitable French colony. It received a vast number of enslaved people for its sugar plantations. Brazil, a Portuguese colony, received the largest number of enslaved Africans of any single territory in the Americas. Its vast size and diverse agricultural and mining economies relied heavily on forced labor. The southern colonies of North America, later part of the United States, were also destinations. Enslaved people were brought to cultivate tobacco, rice, indigo, and later cotton. Upon arrival in the Americas, enslaved people were subjected to further trauma and dehumanization. They were prepared for sale and forced into a new life of bondage. Sales often occurred at auction, where enslaved individuals were inspected and treated as commodities. Families were frequently separated permanently at this stage. Buyers included plantation owners, wealthy merchants, and other colonists who needed labor for agriculture, mining, domestic service, or skilled trades. The ownership of enslaved people was a sign of wealth and status. Once purchased, enslaved people were forced to work under brutal and inhumane conditions. Their lives were dictated by the demands of their enslavers. They often endured severe physical abuse, including beatings, whippings, and other forms of torture. Violence was a tool used to enforce obedience and maximize labor output. They often endured sexual abuse and exploitation, particularly enslaved women. This was a pervasive aspect of slavery, demonstrating the complete lack of control enslaved people had over their own bodies. They were systematically denied basic human rights, including the right to freedom, family, education, and self-determination. Their status as property stripped them of their personhood. Conditions varied somewhat by location, the type of work performed, and the disposition of the enslaver. However, the fundamental reality of forced labor and oppression remained constant. The overarching reality of slavery in the Americas was one of dehumanization and exploitation. Enslaved people were treated as property, not as human beings. Freedom and autonomy were systematically denied to enslaved individuals and their descendants. This system was designed to perpetuate bondage across generations. The transatlantic slave trade left an enduring and complex legacy that continues to shape the world today. Its effects are deeply embedded in global societies. This legacy includes pervasive racism, which emerged as a justification for the enslavement of Africans and continues to manifest in systemic discrimination and prejudice. Racial hierarchies created during slavery persist. It includes profound inequality, both economic and social, between descendants of enslaved people and those who benefited from the trade. The wealth generated by enslaved labor was not shared. It includes deep-seated trauma, passed down through generations, resulting from the violence, separation, and oppression experienced by enslaved people. The psychological wounds are long-lasting. The legacy of the transatlantic slave trade continues to impact societies around the world, influencing demographics, culture, economic structures, and political systems. Understanding this history is crucial for addressing contemporary issues of race and inequality.